Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us today for what should be a very interesting and thought-provoking session. Our presenters today are Janis Riven, Adjunct Professor at the John Molson School of Business and Principal of Governance and Compliance Solutions, and Dora Koop, Managing Director of the McGill International Master's Program, both of whom have tremendous experience with boards and governance matters. Before we start, I'd like to take the opportunity to present the Chartered Governance Institute of Canada for anyone who's not familiar with us. The CGIC is a leader in the practice of good governance. The CGIC was established in Canada in 1920, so 100 years this year, and includes over 800 chartered secretaries, chartered governance professionals, accredited directors, professional administrators, and individuals who are interested in corporate governance across Canada and in Bermuda. CGIC is a division of the Chartered Governance Institute, an international professional body with a network of 9 local divisions supporting over 29,000 members living and working in over 80 countries. CGIC is the only global qualifying organization in Canada that grants chartered status to professionals like you and is committed to empowering, strengthening, and advancing your status. CGIC provides quality education, training services, and advocacy to support excellence in governance. Its certification and education programs include the International Qualifying Program and the Director's Education Program, both of which I have taken and graduated, and the continuing professional development activities such as today's session. If you would like more information, please visit our website. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Janis and Dora.
To create an environment where each director is capable of fulfilling their 2 duties, their fiduciary duty or their duty of loyalty, as it's sometimes called, and their duty of care. And just to reiterate, the duty of loyalty is to act honestly and in good faith with the best interests of the corporation. And the duty of care is to exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in comparable circumstances. So how do we make sure that happens in every meeting as well as virtual meetings? The third goalpost, of course, is, and again recognized in our legislative and regulatory foundations, is that meetings are the legitimate forum in which the board discusses and decides by voting as a unitary body, and this is where all the decisions of the organization originate. So what has changed as we've moved from, as I like to say, as we've moved from the board room to the board Zoom? Well, there's no question that some things never change. For example, the director's duty of care and duty of confidentiality remains the same. And some of us in some organizations have recognized that this duty of care has even become augmented because we have an additional concern about what's happening to our employees. So the same or even augmented. As well, we still need to have open discussion and sharing of information. Thirdly, we need to make sure that decisions are being made and that those decisions are appropriately recorded. And I'm mentioning that because I'm going to mention a couple of times just how challenging it's become with respect to the function of the recording secretary to do that recording in a virtual environment. And finally, we need to make sure that the information flows from those that have all the information to those that have to make the decisions continues to be effective for the decision-making process. So there's no question that there's a lot that's still the same. Our foundations are still the same, but some changes have taken place. If we look at some of the changes, there's been some added value out of this disaster. For example, holding meetings has become lower cost, and certainly this has been quite an advantage fiscally for many smaller not-for-profits, where bringing together can be quite a large part of the expenses of administration. Secondly, having meetings virtually is helping promote better attendance. It's more likely that a board member who may have had to cancel at the last minute attendance at a meeting because of a family emergency, because they had to travel, can now sit in a quiet room and attend the meeting and be able to participate in the decision process. So tremendous advantage to this virtual meeting. Third one, the one I love because I spent a lot of time working on my laptop in front of a camera, is comfort. That when we're at home, when we're in our own space, even if we're still in the office but nobody else is around, we can wear our slippers. You know, I'm sure half of you that are attending this meeting are wearing jeans and not your skirts and your dress pants. So comfort, physical comfort makes people more open and more relaxed and better attendees. So that it's an important value added. But there's also a number of challenges, and we have to deal with issues of engagement and facilitation, technology challenges, personal comfort level. When I speak about personal comfort, it's not just the slippers, it's, oh my gosh, how do I make an impact when I'm shy? I'm even too shy to speak at an in-person meeting. Confidentiality and security, and agenda management. So let's look at these in a little more detail because they're pretty important ones that have to be overcome. With respect to engagement and facilitation, leading a complex discussion and debates in the boardroom can be difficult for the board chair. I don't know how many of you are board chairs. I've been a board chair, and it is a challenge. It's part of a successful board chair is one that can keep the meetings together. And it's tough even in a face-to-face environment. And what happens is a skilled chair studies the board member's body language and facial expressions and is able to manage to react immediately to the mood in the room. You pick it up, you're using your spidey sense, and you focus on one person, you work towards bringing down the temperature or maybe bringing up the temperature. But these are all through visual cues. In virtual meetings, the lack of these visual cues, which can also be an issue in just video conferencing when people are attending in person, means that the chair needs to learn different engagement strategies. For example, board members may find it hard to follow a complicated presentation as well without visual incentives. And when there's long discussions, it can be tempting to put the phone on mute, tune out, and handle private tasks such as reading, texting, or sending emails. When you're in an in-person meeting, this can't happen because everybody's watching you and making sure that your eyes are still open and focused on the person who's speaking. Personal comfort levels. For board members, the absence of nonverbal communication can sometimes make participation awkward. So where you may feel relaxed, surrounded by your colleagues, certainly I personally can attest to that. When I'm on camera, I am struggling all the time not to sing and ah, which is something that's very natural in in-person speech. So participation can feel very awkward for some of your board members. When speaking, when choosing words carefully, this becomes very necessary because the only method of expressing meaning. So interjecting a comment or asking a question during a fast-paced discussion isn't always easy. And some people simply prefer the energy, the momentum that a group has when meeting in person. So a big challenge is, how do you pull those pull-away directors to be as comfortable as they can in a Zoom meeting as they would be in the boardroom? If that's not enough, we have to deal with technology. During a meeting, noisy surroundings, unreliable internet connections, web browser issues, poor sound, poor video quality, these can all be disruptive. I noticed before somebody had forgotten to mute themselves and they were coughing, and I kind of got hung up for a little bit because of the disruption. So it can happen very unintentionally, but it has to be managed. So participants also, they need to hear and they need to be heard clearly throughout the meeting if they want to speak, to prevent a frustration that could cause valuable input to be lost. So you don't want to turn people off. So as well, and back to the recording secretary, for the person who's taking the minutes, voices may sound similar and sound quality problems can be especially challenging. You know, freezing faces, what are they really saying, those gaps, and should the recording secretary interrupt and say, I'm not sure I understood, if they think everybody else understood. It's a real challenge. So training, even for a dynamic, organized board chair, effective participation depends in part on every board member feeling that they can deal with the virtual meeting platform and processes. Any board member who's unfamiliar with the technology, uncomfortable with the technology, and has not had appropriate practice will not be able to participate at their full capacity, and that diminishes the effectiveness of your decision-making process, as well as being unfair to the individual board member. Finally, confidentiality. We'll be talking about this in more detail, but who else is listening? It's very important to feel confident that not only the people that are attending the meeting, but the people that are in the room behind the person attending the meeting is not able to have access to any possible confidential or private information that's being shared during the virtual meeting. So adopting the right practice for your organization, needless to say, you have to start with what you're stuck with, which is your constituting laws and bylaws. Generally speaking, for board meetings, constituting laws do not, unless you've got really old letters patent, do not put a constraint on the capacity of the board to meet virtually. However, your bylaws may, and for many of you, since last March or April, you've had to go back to your bylaws and look at the how to change them in order to permit the board to get together or its committees to hold fully virtual meetings. But that's not such a difficulty. Certainly the AGM process, where many companies have had to wait for new legislation or receive special permissions from their legislative or regulatory bodies to hold virtual meetings, has been a challenge. The only constraint you'll find in the legislation, and probably in your bylaws it's reiterated, is that all members of a meeting who are entitled to be there must be able to be heard and to hear and to have their vote recorded. So in order to find and adopt the right best practices, the emphasis is really to move forward strategically, to think about how can we mitigate virtual meeting risks and exploit some of the emerging opportunities, all in a way that fits with your particular governance structure, your processes, and most important, the culture of your organization. As I mentioned in our to-do list at the beginning of this session, that in looking at right best practices for each organization, I'd like to suggest that there's two pillars. There's the compliance pillar and there's the culture pillar. The compliance approach is, I think we have to consider compliance as it's necessary to support the structure with strong rules and enforcement to ensure that at least the minimum standards and rules are being adhered to. What we find is in most organizations, typical compliance best practices are put into things that, tools like meeting protocols in a code of conduct, position mandates, job descriptions that describe responsibilities related to meetings. Technology protocols have become very popular recently with, you know, what's being password protected, what kind of meetings have to be password protected, whether or not meetings can be recorded or should be recorded, and other such technical requirements from a compliance viewpoint. Finally, there's no question that most organizations have adopted a compliance requirement for minimum training for anybody who is going to be attending meetings to ensure that they are not going to disrupt the meeting because they don't understand the meeting rules. So what I'd like to suggest is ways to improve everybody's compliance approach. Because basically, there's no question that everybody jumped out of their chairs and basically leaving the office when they were all told to go home if you could go home, or to wear your masks and socially distance in the office. But everything changed mid-March of 2020. And we have to recognize that all of us had to put in tools very quickly on an ad hoc basis, pull things together with Band-Aids and Scotch tape in order to deal with the increase in virtual meetings in your organization. And maybe this is a time to take a big breath and become strategic about it, because I think we all realize now that despite the fact that the light is at the end of the tunnel, and a vaccine is coming, and we will be out into the light again in the spring or summer, the benefits of virtual meetings have been acknowledged, and we're all getting accustomed to how we can make decisions in a virtual environment coupled with an in-person environment that permits strategically for the organization to make more effective decisions. So my suggestion, it's a very simple one, is take what you have in place right now, but do a very careful review before too many things get buried in filing cabinets as we get back to normal. Review all your current documents that are related to meeting management, your code of conduct, position descriptions, your meeting protocols, your technology requirements, your policies, procedures, that all got pushed together in the past 7 or 8 months, as well as the ones that were sitting around beforehand. Write down into your bylaws. And look for ways to find where there's too much direction. You know, we're getting way down into the weeds and, you know, telling people what pair of socks to wear in the morning. Or are there conflicting instructions? Because that's what happens when there's too many people involved in trying to make things right. Are there divergent standards? That becomes very, that can become quite difficult and dangerous. And finally, are you still missing anything? Is there still a best practice that you haven't adopted that would really help? So that's thoughts for how to better practice your compliance approach. But let's look at the culture-based approach. Here, we want to acknowledge that the culture of the organization can be reflected in how the board and its committees function as a group within their decision-making process. But what it means is it's a call to all your board members to acknowledge, to celebrate, and to enhance the culture of the board, which hopefully reflects the culture of the organization. So the idea here is to look at what your key values are in the organization, in the board. Is it inclusivity? Is it working as a team? Is it mutual respect? Is it all three? Is it something else? And how do you pull the meanings from those values and translate them into tools, best practices, ways of working better together as an organization and as a small decision-making body? So what I propose, because I don't like to just start with problems and tell you to go away and fix your own problems. So here's a thought. Many organizations have a general charter of expectations or a statement of expectations. It's something somewhat softer than a job description for board members or a job description for the board of directors. It's much like a terms of reference, but it's more of an asking document rather than a set of rules and what you have to do to, quote, stay out of jail. So my proposal is you could consider creating this charter or statement of expectations as a general document to include a section on meeting expectations and refer to additional expectations to deal with virtual meetings. If you already have a director job description or a charter or some document that it sets out what's expected of your individual directors, and it's working well, then no need to change the world. It could be that you develop an additional statement of expectations just for meetings that would pull together some of the softer behavioral expectations that you currently have worded in some of your protocols or in your code of conduct, and pull them in with the meeting management expectations in this charter or statement. So I've thrown that out there as hopefully some of you will consider it a good idea. But I think that at this point, we see that there's opportunities for improvement for all of us, and we want to put those improvements in place with whatever tools and practices we have. Let's turn to understanding the technologies and getting comfortable with technologies. And frankly, when I put technology and comfort together, those two words to me are the most uncomfortable oxymoron that I could imagine, because I'm not comfortable with technology, but we have to do it. So there's no question that Zoom, Microsoft Teams, most of the virtual platforms allow for both written chats and oral chats through raising of hands or unmuting. Going to the oral chats, there's a lot of benefits to having, written chats. Questions and comments will tend to be more focused because people that have to write down what they want to say will do it with a little more care than if they have to burst out with a question or a comment. And if it's sent to everybody that's in the meeting, then it provides an opportunity for everybody to consider the comment or the question, have their own thoughts put in place before a discussion takes place. And the chair can control the timing of dealing with a particular chat, question, or comment based on the time available. However, downside is that if people are too busy chatting, they're not listening, whether it's a written chat or an oral side chat. So it could distract from listening, and part of this culture of meetings is helping directors to stay focused on what's happening in the meeting and not having side conversations, even if it's with everybody. It will tend to chill open discussion because some issues need to be spoken to. This is where the chair is constantly having to navigate, what should I open for oral discussion, what can be managed through a chat forum. And of course, if somebody does put forward a question and it's not responded to, then that director or a member of the management team can feel ignored, and that creates a negative vibe. My biggest bugaboo is private messages in any forum. Private messages, as far as I'm concerned, pose a threat to the holding, where you're going to hold a meeting, a tiny meeting, within the context of the full meeting. It's inappropriate. The private messages do not belong in the business of a board or committee meeting, period. And anybody that disagrees with me is certainly entitled to send me a threatening email, but I'm very, very strong on that one. In terms of oral chatting, whether you raise your hand like this, or you use the little icon, the little hand icon, they're useful as well. It permits spontaneous feedback. I want to say something right away. I'm really excited about what I just heard, and which is good. And certainly if it's a smaller group of people on the meeting, it works very well. It means it's a dynamic meeting. Everybody's engaged. It's as close as you can get to open discussion in an in-person meeting. But some control is required by the chair in order to acknowledge hand raising if it's a larger meeting. The issue with oral chatting, of course, is that the chair can sometimes, if there's too many people putting their hands up, it can send time limits out of whack, and there's a danger of agenda items not being covered. As well, for the recording secretary, it's very difficult to note who said what in a chat, as well as what the what was that was what was being discussed in the chat line. So some issues, some thoughts for benefits. So getting comfortable with the other aspect of available technologies in Zoom or other virtual platforms is breakout rooms. And I'd like to go through that first. Breakout rooms are terrific. They're useful for discussions where you want to, for the purpose of the meeting, break people into smaller groups to focus on key issues. It can be done during a lunch break. It can be controlled. Different breakout rooms are given different discussion topics and then brought back into the meeting to give their recommendations or elaborate on their decision. So there's no question that it provides for deeper and wider engagement on specific issues. And as part of that social aspect, it really does help board members, especially if it's a large board, become more familiar and comfortable with each other in a less formal environment. So it's got some really terrific advantages where the breakout room allows for written comments. Then the chair can post questions, receive comments, and be able to share them with everybody. Of course, the big issue is that it requires additional time, as virtual meetings, we've all discovered, requires additional time for feedback on results to the full board. But my thumbs down is on the idea of informal online forums. And I know this is an issue, and this is the last little bit before we move into socializing, because people between meetings do need to socialize and want to socialize and have issues clarified. But having informal forum outside of a meeting where not everybody is invited, or if everybody's invited, it's outside of the control and context of a formal board meeting, this can compromise the principle that any board business must be dealt with in a meeting in which all board members are entitled to participate and where it can be recorded. So an online forum, you may have written comments, but if not everybody is at the meeting that ought to be at the meeting, there's confidentiality risks. It could be that you have 2 or 3 people that are nagging about somebody else they don't like in the boardroom, or they don't like the way the chair dealt with a particular issue at the last meeting. anything written or recorded in these informal sessions can become discoverable in a litigation. So there is a security risk at that level as well. And there's no question that potential for misinformation, the possibility of information straying into the wrong hands can interfere with the chair's ability to do their job effectively. So thumbs down on informal meetings of members of the board between meetings that have anything to do with the business of the board that belongs in a full meeting. Finally, communication during meetings can be a lot more effective if there's some pre-meeting presentation. Two possibilities that we can do now with the virtual environment is consider pre-recording management presentations. So the meeting doesn't have to be taken up with the management presentation. The directors can watch it on their own time prior to the meeting, and then the meeting can be focused on questions and comments. And another suggestion is that if the chair is having a discussion with a member of the management team, chair management discussion on a particular issue, this can be recorded and provided to the full board as background material as well. So it saves the time of the committee chairs as well as the time of the full board meeting. So this results in shorter, more focused meetings, and of course, more interaction time during meetings. So why do you communicate between meetings? Just why? To share ideas with your board colleagues, to express concerns that you have about the meeting, but to the chair, not to other board members, not a crabbing session, but gee, I didn't feel comfortable with the way this was handled by so-and-so, you talk to the chair about it. To ask a colleague for information. One of your colleagues at the board meeting seemed to be expert on a certain matter. You call up and say, gee, I didn't know anything about that. Can you tell me a little bit more? I found it very interesting. And of course, for networking, there's nothing wrong with networking between meetings and getting to know each other better. But avoid trying to affect the decision process. This is formal board business. And avoid creating division within the team by having he said, she said, or we believe this and they don't believe that, because that's going to weaken the team culture of the board. And as I mentioned before, there's discoverability, which creates legal risk. In terms of the how-tos and how not tos, I'll just reiterate it again. Best way is to pick up the phone and have a chat. Email's good, but beware of the risks of written communication and what can happen with written communications. You can set up breakout rooms, but it should be done through the board chair for a particular purpose between meetings. And finally, chat rooms, online forums are a big no-no. So with that, I'd like to turn the slides now over to my colleague Dora Koop, because she wants to talk to you about much more interesting stuff, which is trust and socializing. Dora?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Janis. And there will be some overlap between what's been said between the two of us. But I think that when we think of the informal side and we think of all those dinners that we have and the coffee breaks that we've been used to, we don't always think of why. And having this virtual forum, to me, has put into sort of focus. Why do we have these informal discussions and what purpose do they serve? And I have sort of linked it all back to trust. And we know that trust is sort of a cornerstone of all human relationships. And it's really vital to well-functioning boards between directors and management. And it's important to organizations as a whole. So this whole idea of trust and why it's so important is because it reduces risk and it enables efficient, effective decision-making. There's a high cost to not having trust within your board or within your organization. And I think that that's part of why we have these informal things. How do we build trust? It's especially crucial during times of crisis. This pandemic is a crisis. And when you're undergoing massive change. I think that when we look at it, and another reason that we know why it's so important, it's this requirement of timely, accurate information without fear of repercussion. So there is a risk, as Janet says, if people don't feel comfortable to speak up. What are you missing in your board meetings? Why aren't they speaking up? How can you get over that? And part of that is to ensure trust between the members. So one of the ways to develop trust is to get to know each other. And in some of the studies, there's different ways of defining trust, but one of it's based on vulnerability, which is based on human relationships, to make yourself vulnerable, to get that personal side of you out there. So how do you do that? And that's part of what this is about when you're in a virtual world. It's much more difficult than where you're in face-to-face periods. So pre-COVID, some of the things we did to get to know each other so that we could develop this trust is we had pre-board meetings and dinners, and we talked, and we'd come in early, and we'd maybe go for cocktails afterwards, cocktails before. The whole idea was just to get to know each other, a little bit more about each other, how people thought, where they came from, what their point of view was. Sometimes there was informal chats during coffee breaks, during the board meetings. You had strategic retreats, a chance to go away. It wasn't just to do the strategy piece, it was also to get to know each other. One of the boards that I sat on, we did a lot of tours of facilities across the country. So every time there was a board meeting, we would walk around and look at the facilities that were part of our organization. So an important part of chatting with management, getting to know each other, and a continuing education piece for those who are on boards. And finally, we used to have celebrations. We'd have holiday dinners at this time of the year. We'd have award ceremonies, or there might be retirement parties, chance to get to know each other as directors, but also, and I keep emphasizing this, is management, because I think that trust has to go both ways. So what do we do now? Creating the virtual water cooler. So I've divided it up into two parts. One is during the board meetings, and we probably aren't really aware of how we chat during the board meetings, how we get to know each other, creating that sense of bonding. So one of the things the chair can do to start, and again, Janis really referred to this as that position of the chair, and I think this has become more and more important. And I have to say that most of these ideas and things that have come through informal discussions I've had with board members and directors. So these are real observations or things that people are doing now. And we'll look forward to your ideas at the end of the chat as well. So before the meeting, the chair should check in with the directors. How are you doing? Take a few minutes. There's different ways that you can do it, but it helps park what is on people's minds. They can get off the screen. They're forced to look at each other and sort of bring each other up to date. One suggestion was candor breaks. So as Janis said, sometimes in a meeting, you can pick up visual cues. Someone really is not comfortable with what's being said, but they're not speaking. If you have a specific time just for 2 minutes, anything that's not being said, is there somebody who doesn't feel like they're being heard? So just a couple of minutes throughout your meeting, check in with everyone and make sure that their voice is being heard. Or maybe they don't understand something. And then at the end of the meeting, again, you can spend a few minutes on the personal aspects of the directors' lives. Somebody had the suggestion, you see into people's rooms, you see into their background. And so, oh, what's that sculpture? Where did you get that? I see that every time we're on a meeting. Or it's just a chance to open up and come and become more personal with people. Another idea was a virtual water cooler breakout room. And as many of you know, when you have a coffee break during the meeting, you'll be back in 15 minutes, but you might come back in 5 and then you sit around looking at your screen and everybody's name and nobody there. So if you can create a virtual water cooler breakout room, people can come back and just chat and catch up before the formal meeting starts again. Make sure everybody who's on the screen is introduced. It seems really straightforward, but somebody said that happened to them, that somebody was not introduced. A new management person was in the room on the screen and was never introduced. And I know, Janis, this question of having directors with their camera on is sometimes a question, but really, how can you engage with people if you can't see their faces? And I think that's a fundamental, it's a policy that should be in every board meeting. Outside the board meeting, so we heard Janis say you have to be careful of what kind of business you engage in outside, but when there isn't business, what can you do? And it's been repeated many times to me to keep up the rituals. If you've got an award ceremony, maybe send around a bottle of champagne to everybody so that when you have the ceremony online, everybody can drink to each other, drink to their health. Have an informal cocktail Zoom the night before the board meeting where no business is discussed. And you make those rules and establish that just to create that checking in, making sure people are all right. This whole period, some people are very isolated. And I think these check-ins help and keeps that personal side of things again close and being able to talk to each other. Keep up training programs that allow directors to interact informally while taking a deep dive into a particular subject. If management's in the room on these subjects, it's a chance to see another side of people, hear opinions, not be so constrained by the meeting and the processes within a meeting. In some cases, people have not only formal business training, but I know companies where they do yoga once a week, or maybe a meditation session, but the whole idea isn't really, it's twofold. It's yes, the yoga helps reduce stress, but it's also a chance to engage with others in your organization. Just because it's something that is a little different again. And I know some boards where they've had very high turnover during this session. And as you know, new directors, how do you get to know them? And usually you may have a couple of calls with them. There may be the chair will call them, maybe the CEO will call a new director. Then when the meeting comes, they're introduced and chat a bit over lunch. You may chat during a coffee break, but how do you do it when you're virtual? And I think that it may be on those board directors or corporate secretary to suggest these Zoom meetings, to be really intentional about setting them up. Virtual facility tours, and invite other directors on them, even if they've been on them, just this chance to chat. If you're co-located and if you're allowed, maybe you can have a new director join with someone who's on the board for a walk, a face-to-face activity where it's just a chance to meet and greet, and it starts creating some bonds as well. Create events where new directors can meet other directors informally, like Zoom cocktails we mentioned. Maybe there's a special speaker luncheon. As we know now, it's much easier to invite someone in from outside the organization and spend half an hour with a talk. In some organizations I've known, they've sent out tickets, virtual tickets for a symphony experience where everybody can be together, and sort of a reward, but also a chance to enjoy something that the company can offer you. So that was really a brief and a quick overview of some of the things that you can do informally. And I just want to again emphasize that it's not just to chat, but there's a reason why you need to form those bonds so that your meetings are more efficient, you get to know each other, and then hopefully when all of this is through, you've got a strong board that's bonded, that trust each other and can move forward. So then we're open for other ideas. Maybe you've been doing some things that have been great, or maybe there's some questions that you have that either Janis or I raised. We're open to it.
Dora, I have one question from Jyothi in the chat. He asks, do you have any tips on holding virtual in-camera sessions? If you need more explanation, maybe you need to address them and ask, unless you know what that is.
Janis, did you have something?
Yes, it's a challenge because often it's management that sets up the in-camera or the Zoom meeting. And so what the chair has to do ahead of time is ensure that they can take over as co-host and that you have an appropriate security so that password protected, so that when you can identify who's gone off the call and who's left on. That's very important, and that's why you need passwords at the beginning. So it's really just, it's having that additional security of managing who can still listen and who can still hear on the meeting. But it can be managed with the additional password protection and the chair ensuring that the right people have left the meeting and the right people are still on. I hope that answers your question.
There were two questions on that same topic, so I think that was an important one.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think it's really important to keep up with that process and make sure that it's part of every meeting. It's very clear, and whether there's a lot of business or not to cover in the in-camera, it's got to be on every agenda. So no surprises.
Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to enter them in the chat or unmute your microphone.
Any ideas of what you've done to keep up that informal way of keeping connected with people?
I have no new questions for you ladies today. All right. Well, thank you very much, Janis and Dora. That was very informative. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Oh, somebody does have a question here. Sorry. I have found that people don't like to eat in front of each other. Drinking is okay.
Well, it depends. It depends what you're drinking. But I agree with the eating. I do a lot of workshops and with multiple people sitting on their videos, and when they start eating, it's actually quite disgusting. So it's good if you have a protocol where you discourage people from eating, ask them to turn off their video for 5 minutes while they chomp, and then come back on. That's because if you're having a long, 2 or 3 hour meeting, some people have to eat to survive. So you have to give them the opportunity, but tell them we don't want to watch you.
Yeah, and I think that says, it goes back to your bio breaks to make sure that they're scheduled in there. So if someone does have to grab a snack, they can go and do that. And then, like I said, I think this virtual breakout room where people can come back if they are there and they want to sit and talk to people, it's there, it's available. But those that need to eat or do whatever can take those few minutes to do it.
Those are great points, Dora and Janis. Thank you. Okay, we'll end today's session. Thank you everyone for attending. If any of you need a letter confirming your time here for your CPD, just email me at info@charteredgovernanceinstitute.ca and I'll send you along something. Thank you everybody, and happy holidays. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you in the new year. And